But anyway, I mean, I still think even if Apple TV is great and they really knock it out of the park, I still think the smartphone is the primary digital device, primary internet device for people for the foreseeable future. I just can't see what it would be replaced with. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. I'm joined this week by Iain and by special guest Paula Gilbert, who is the editor of Connecting Africa website. Is that right?
It is.
If I called it right. And that is part of our sort of broad stable of Telecoms.com, Light Reading and various other ones that I probably get told off for not mentioning. But there we are. If they want to be mentioned, then come on a pod, innit?
Exactly.
Okay.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So welcome, Paula.
Thanks very much.
And we are going to we're going to start by talking about the smartphone numbers. The global smartphone shipment numbers came out this week and what relevance that has to certain of the big vendors, including Apple. We're then going to have a little chat. Iain wrote an excellent bit of more analysis comparing the current sort of telecom situation to the OPEC oil crisis of 1975 or something like that.
73.
Which I thought 73. Okay, my bad. It was all sorted by 75.
Jesus Christ, Scott.
I know.
Do you remember it?
What an amateur.
You're older than me. You should remember that.
Yeah,
You're at least 2 then.
I was 2. Yes, I was 2 when it happened. I remember, actually, sometimes you get these things, people put these things on Twitter where they obviously fabricate little quotes from their kids to try and make some crude point. Like, you know, my 5-year-old son came down the stairs the other day and said, "Oh, why is Boris Johnson so horrible?" or something like that. People obviously just make this stuff up. I could make up some 2-year-old Scott going, "Daddy, I'm really worried about the OPEC oil crisis." I think we need to concern ourselves with energy security. Anyway, so that was well, I won't mischaracterise your article anymore, but we're going to chat about that, and then of course because Paula is expert, certainly compared to me, on the African telecom situation, we'll finish off by chatting about that a little bit. Okay. Oh yes, and got a little look from Pierre there. And if you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube or the site, you can listen to it on iTunes or SoundCloud or countless other podcasting platforms, and vice versa. Right. So smartphone numbers. So that's every quarter. I wrote these up. This is what I used to do in my previous life, was track these things obsessively. What basically happened, I'm trying to remember what my headline was. I said something like, Samsung grows, Huawei slows, and Apple flows. I think I did. The last one was slightly forced. I was really struggling for another O's when it came to Apple. But, you know, you can't do 2 and not have a third, can you? You can't then just go Apple goes to the toilet.
I missed Samsung's figures. I was aware of Huawei and Apple, but I wasn't really sure what had happened with Samsung this time.
So they actually...
Who won?
You what?
Who won?
Who won? Okay, well, if you let me finish, Pierre, I'll tell you.
Stop interrupting.
Samsung actually had year-on-year quarterly growth for the first time in about a couple of years. So that means that when you compare quarter on quarter, which obviously you do because of seasonality, Q4 is always much bigger for everyone, especially Apple. Then they actually grew. So they had a pretty difficult last year. I think the Galaxy S9 was a bit shit. And so they didn't sell so many. Presumably the S10's a little bit better.
Yeah.
And so
I
that was
prefer the 9.
Yeah.
Right. You've got one of you. So it's not shite in your.
What's the difference?
Doesn't catch fire.
So the only thing that's
is that what that is?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
The thing that irritates me with the 10 is the fingerprint reader doesn't work.
Oh.
For me, at least. I don't know what's wrong with my fingerprints.
Have you
But,
done anything?
because it's one that's on the screen.
Your face as well. Does it do that?
Yeah, you can use your face.
Right.
Does that work?
It does, yeah.
Does it
But
stop
I feel
It's a
like
bit sinister, I think.
it's really weird. I don't want to use my face to open my phone.
And these are not secure. It's not like the iPhone that, it takes a 3D mapping of your face. You could hold a picture of yourself to the camera and it would unlock.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's a
So it's not really
2D
very
thing.
safe.
Yeah.
No.
And then the fingerprint scan is an optical one rather than full-on biometric. Like
Is that better on Apple as well, Pierre?
But all the S9 has that too.
So the S9 has it on the back. So you can use your finger, you can scan it on the back, which is easier for me.
Yeah,
that's what
doing
I
it on
do
the
with
screen,
this Pixel too. Look, I've got a little.
Yeah, but like on the
thing.
screen, I just have to
This is all in the effort to reduce the
on
notch.
the 10.
All for the notch.
And we just got another wicket. Anyway,
anyway,
just for anyone who's listening to this when we put it up on Monday, this is the Thursday, the first day of the Ashes, and I'm tracking the cricket score. While
Do you think the Ashes is more important than the World Cup?
What, the Cricket World Cup?
Yeah.
It's different. No, I think that's a bigger thing,
yeah.
but it's the really intense rivalry between England and Australia, especially in the area of cricket, even more than rugby, I think. Yeah. Anyway, bit of a tangent. Yeah. We won't get onto South African sporting success.
Well, I mean, we play cricket, so...
They're good at rugby. Good at rugby.
Yeah, I mean...
Well, not as good as...
We have our moments.
Yeah.
Currently cricket, not so much. Let's not talk about the World Cup.
yeah, he didn't do so well, did he?
No.
Where was I? Oh, yeah. So, okay, so you think the S10...
Well, I mean, that's just...
You think the S9
maybe
is
it's just
decent?
one thing that irritated me, and then I didn't really want to use the 10 that much.
Fair enough.
But, I mean, the camera's
So what,
great,
did you get hold of it in a reviewing capacity, or did you just get offered an upgrade, or...?
Yeah, Samsung gave it to us to review at a point, yeah.
So this is the 9 here, yeah?
Yeah, this is the 9.
Have a look.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, mine was anecdotal. I did actually review the 9.
The thing was, I just got the 9 when the 10 came
see.
out, so then maybe I was already convinced.
Yeah.
But I mean, people's opinions.
Well, I just remember more broadly the anecdotal, just reading like the main tech sites' reviews seemed a bit sort of meh about it.
Were there any 5G phones included in their shipments?
Yeah.
Not not
the
explicitly broken out. It's just top line all shipments.
Right.
I mean,
did they mention it at all? Or?
Well, that was one thing in my analysis. No, they didn't. But in my analysis, I said maybe another thing that has benefited Samsung is that the S10's pretty much the flagship 5G phone right now.
That's the one everybody's making a fuss about, isn't it?
Exactly.
Sorry.
So
I thought it was the one.
And there's been a big push for the
Americano.
10 everywhere. The 10, like the push for it has been pretty big. So
yeah. Well, Samsung's never shy about chucking marketing money around. That's for
that's
sure.
true.
Especially as people have been withdrawing the Huawei ones.
Yeah, well, that could be another thing. So that Huawei is currently the number 2 global smartphone vendor, and I was kind of expecting a decline in their phones because obviously, the US they haven't been shipping to the US anyway. But there's all this aggro, and then there's this stuff to do with Android.
Yeah.
And we're one.
Yeah.
And obviously, if they can't have proper full fat Android on their phones, who's going to buy them? And I wondered if that's going to creep back if people are already. So like if I was going to buy a new smartphone now, and I thought there was a prospect of Android not being supported in 6 months' time, then
when
that
did
might
they
maybe
get
not
stuck
do
on
it.
the entity list? May.
Something like that.
So
Yeah.
this is April to June.
Yeah,
So I guess they had the first half of
exactly.
it, and then
I think we'll see more movement in the next quarter.
Yeah.
maybe the
So
one
there
after
was a bit
that.
of movement because they've been growing at like sort of 20% quarter on quarter, and they only grew 8%. So that's why I said slows.
Yeah.
Their growth has just
what
definitely
phone
slowed.
shipments? Actual phone shipments.
Huawei's smartphone shipments, grew by 8%, but that's the slowest growth for quite a while.
Right.
So it could be, if that trend continues, that it'll go into decline in Q3 and Q4.
But it still seemed to be the bit of the business that really kind of
when you're
boosted
talking about their
sales.
numbers.
When you're talking about numbers.
Yeah, because I think for the reason we said, it hasn't really dropped off properly yet.
Yeah.
The NC listing, as you say, and all the Android stuff didn't really kick in till halfway through Q2.
Yeah.
And they've got a lot of momentum. And as I'm sure we might go into a little bit more later, there are plenty of parts of the world that are still pretty keen on Huawei, both in terms of networking gear and in terms of handsets.
Yeah.
But it was interesting looking at, I think for the first time ever in a first half report, they'd actually broken out the revenues from the different business units. So they have their carrier one that sells networks.
It's interesting how they're getting more and more transparent to try and make a point.
But you couldn't compare it with last year's because they didn't do that last year. But what you could do is look at full year results last year and see what it was as a proportion of that. And I noticed, I think, networks was about half of what they made last year, which suggests flat. I mean, I know there's seasonal factors as well, so it's a bit hard to know, but it suggests it's pretty flat. And then enterprise is quite down, actually.
Right.
It was maybe 30, 35, 40% of what they made last year, I think.
Right.
So
it's interesting. I wonder why that would be.
Yeah, well,
You'd think that would be the least sensitive to all this
speculating
geopolitical stuff would be the business stuff, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but Robert did sort of wonder if Robert Clark, who's our freelancer in Hong Kong, who did the story, he was sort of wondering whether the components issues had some kind of effect on that part of the business to do with servers, that they weren't able to, server equipment perhaps they weren't able to source.
That's possible. Although when we've spoken about servers, it's been pointed out that no one's giving Lenovo a hard time.
Yeah.
As a server vendor.
No, they're not.
So there's some. When we've gone over this
your
countless
mate,
times.
Strand Consult's often on about that, isn't he? John Strand.
John Strand, yeah.
Yeah.
He. I think. Well, John's hello, John, if you're listening. I think John seems to feel fairly suspicious of the business practices of lots of Chinese companies, including Huawei. But I think he's also the first to call out if there's hypocrisy in terms of, like, we just had a story. I didn't write it up today, but I noticed it when I was sort of looking for stuff to write about. That Cisco's just settled something to do with a bit of moodiness and some security cameras and all that sort of thing.
Right.
And it's just a reminder. I think they're very transparent and they've settled, and it's all. I don't think it caused any aggro, but it's just another reminder that it's not just Chinese companies that can present a security risk. Anyway, we've chatted about that before as well.
Yeah.
So I think if I had to make a forecast, I'd say maybe we will look at flat growth or even decline in year-on-year Huawei smartphone numbers. I as long as this Android thing, as long as that cloud hangs over them.
They sort of rang a few alarms about it as well, didn't they, in the press conference? I mean, they kind of made some statements that were quite, I don't want to say panicky, but it was, things are not, what's that thing they're developing themselves? Hongmeng, is it, or something?
What, their own OS?
Yeah. And they said that's not ready, and this Android issue is quite serious unless it gets resolved.
I think for consumers, it's like the biggest worry, and it's the thing that's going to make people not want to get a Huawei phone.
Yeah.
Because the App Store, if you can't get all of the normal things that you want, why would you get that phone if you can't use Google Maps?
Exactly,
Obviously, it doesn't matter for China because Google's banned anyway, but for the rest of the world.
A great illustration of how not having proper Android is disastrous is do you remember when Amazon tried to launch its own premium smartphone called the Fire phone?
Yes.
And the specs
sounds like an ominous name to begin with. Like, did they think Fire was a good one
I
think
that was launched before Samsung's Note started blowing up in people's pockets. But yes, in hindsight, an interesting choice. And it was fully spec'd, all the latest, good cameras, good chips, good screens, good everything. But it had this forked version of Android, much as you can get Amazon Fire tablets. And they sell all right as sort of entry-level tablets. And again, it's forked, but people aren't so bothered, and Amazon's just basically selling them as loss leaders to try and get people to buy more stuff from Amazon. But this thing absolutely failed, and I knew it would because they launched it not long after I stopped being a smartphone analyst. And I'd been tracking all these. This was back when the operating system duopoly wasn't as clear-cut as it is now. We still had Microsoft.
Symbian, did you have that then?
Well, so Symbian was in decline. So this is basically Symbian went into massive decline as soon as the iPhone and Android came along, which is about 07, 08.
Yeah.
But prior to that, Symbian was completely dominant. And I remember I reviewed a Symbian phone at the time and concluded that it was fine until you use an Android or an iPhone, and then it.
Yeah.
Things just moved on. The Touch OS, all that sort of thing, were just much better, and the app stores. But we still had BlackBerry, we still had Microsoft efforts. We had things like Tizen, and we had WebOS, the Palm thing. We basically had quite a few, and we were doing all these. I used to have to do this incredibly detailed forecast, where it was by country, by quarter, and by smartphone OS. So the spreadsheet was enormous.
How did you get all that data? Did you just go around phoning people up?
Yeah, some of it. I mean, I don't want to.
Well,
in case any of my old colleagues, any of my old colleagues
Scott,
from Strategy Analytics are listening, I don't want to give too many trade secrets away. But I can say there's a degree of conjecture.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I genuinely think that analysts is another tangent. I think a lot of what analysts do, obviously analysts do have intelligence, they do chat to people. I still use Strategy Analytics numbers for the smartphone because I remember when we were there, we'd be one of the few analyst firms that were actually chatting to people like Samsung who don't publish their numbers. But so there is intelligence, but yeah. I think on top of the intelligence, what analysts are, they're basically paid to be better guessers than everyone else.
Yeah.
So, so you might use an analyst firm partly as a sort of sanity check mechanism. You're like, okay, we reckon this. Let's check in with these third parties whose day job it is to reckon stuff.
Yeah.
And obviously, if we had someone from SA&E, if we had my old boss from SA&E, he'd be going, Scott's talking shit, all this is nailed down, and that's absolutely fine. But yes, obviously, no, there's not like this repository of every single hard data point just sitting there.
Yeah.
So, of course, there's got to be some conjecture.
What's the overall take at the moment on the market. Was there something from Canalysis this week that I saw, or did I imagine that? Did they not do?
So SA came out with some stuff.
Right.
Counterpoint, which is run by a couple of people who used to be on my team at SA.
Right.
Tom and Neil. They went off and started up their own thing. Well, Tom started it up. And there's Canalis, not Canalysis.
Canalis, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Apologies.
Yeah, it's Canalis. I think IDC. I mean, it's that time of year. As soon as Apple comes out with its numbers, normally everyone then just publishes their stuff.
Canalysis is what happens when Canalis merges with Analysis Mason.
There we go. Yes. Or
is that what you're predicting?
That's what. Yeah.
Or it's a very specific subset of analysis where you just look at canals.
All that. Yeah.
Yeah. Bad dad joke there.
Sounds like a Valerian name.
Valerian.
Yeah.
Oh, you're not. Have you started watching Game of Thrones from the start again?
No.
We had Paula. Pierre just binge watched Game of Thrones, like
all 7 seasons, and it was 8, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then he had nothing else in his head, and that's
exactly.
What he talked about.
And as you can see, he's still making, frankly, unsupported Game of Thrones links. Where were we? Yeah. So the overall market's in decline, in slow decline, has been for about a year or so. And actually, that brings me on to the Apple thing. So they have their year-on-year shipments have declined quite steadily.
Yeah.
For about a year or so.
But they've stopped reporting actual shipment numbers, haven't they?
Well, which was a bit suspicious to
Yeah.
start with, because what have they got to hide?
They just show revenues from
Exactly,
from
and so again, I don't know to what extent people like my former colleagues at SA will actually ring up Apple and go, "Come on, tell us," or whether they're having to do some sort of clever maths to work it all out.
Well, I suppose they can look at the ASPs, can't they? And
yeah, you can look at ASPs, you can look at revenue proportion, and then you can extrapolate. If you track what revenue proportion used to be when you had the hard numbers, you can extrapolate that ratio. There's all sorts of bits of this is giving me flashbacks to my old job. There's all sorts of spreadsheet mucking about you can do.
all that maths comes in handy, yeah.
Well, it's more spreadsheety stuff. You don't need to be amazingly good at maths, but
No.
if you're pretty handy at Excel, that definitely helps. And there were some people there who've forgotten more than I'll ever know about Excel. Way's probably much better at Excel than I am. So they've been in steady decline, and I think one of the big reasons is what's the word they use? The amount of time, the upgrade cycle.
Yeah.
So typically we've before the smartphone era, the upgrade cycle was about a year to 18 months. And in the modern smartphone era, it's been about 2 years, because that's typically been the length of contracts. I don't know if it's the same as South Africa. So people typically upgrade when they get a new contract.
Yeah.
But I think people more and more, like I did, they're just going, no, I'm gonna sweat the asset a little bit more.
The problem is that Apple's phones, they make 2 good phones, so
yeah, exactly.
They can last
they're still
for 4 years.
Yeah.
They're still perfectly decent,
and the new ones don't have anything new in them, really.
So what's the point? Pay all that money.
Unless you're Pierre, who loves everything they do and buys phones.
But there are people like that,
I went
right?
from the 6 to the 10, and I still have the 10.
He's still got an X.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
He hasn't got an X.
But do you think they're losing a bit of that shine, like the people who were, they wanted the new one every time it came out?
I think so.
I think so, because I don't think there's enough
innovation
in the. But I don't think it's just an Apple issue. I think it's a device issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I exaggerated this. I know in my story a bit. It was a bit silly about the end of the smartphone.
You're wondering what I'm going to hassle you about in your story, aren't you?
You're going to hassle me about it.
Just
being
you should
provocative.
know that I said when I was chatting with Iain and Paula before this, I said I might pick apart some of Ian's rationale. I'll get to that in a second. It's no big deal, mate. Don't worry. Calm down.
You can pick it apart. That's okay.
No, well, I'm going to come on to it, actually, because it's an interesting point. So the refresh cycle is getting lengthened. And I think you're right. I think it's partly because the phone's still perfectly decent after 3 years. And part of it is there's no compelling reason to upgrade. There isn't a new feature set that's just making people rush to shops and drop $1,000 on a new phone.
Especially now that you can replace the battery for what, 40, 30 pounds?
Right. Can you?
$35? Yeah.
The
main thing that's crap after 3 years is the battery.
Yeah.
Well,
that's the thing that always dies first. Sorry.
I think it's interesting as well that with 5G, some of the operators certainly Vodafone, which is quite a significant player obviously in Europe, has made a big push on SIM-only plans with its 5G tariffs. And
Yeah, and the secondary market, i.e. the second-hand phone market.
First of all, but
especially for 5G, you need a 5G phone.
But they've introduced these all-you-can-eat, 30. I think it's £30 a month in the UK.
Yeah,
and that's just the SIM-only sort of plan. So.
Yeah, or you can spend 20. You can spend 20 quid and get about 10 gig a month, which is roughly what I do. And I never use that up.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's lots of reasons to go SIM only, and the second-hand market's pretty good. And Apple's actually contributed to that. We've now got quite a formal sort of Apple-approved second-hand iPhone thing.
Yeah.
So they're kind of contributing to that themselves, but that's probably quite sensible because it's in the sort of if it's going to happen anyway, we might as well have a piece of the action. Seems to be the logic.
It's greener as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, quite.
Yeah. Yeah. No one cares about that. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah. All right, hippie boy.
Yeah.
But that brings me on to the point I want to make about your analysis of Apple. So you and I made this point, and a few other people noted that in terms of revenues, this was the first quarter that Apple's iPhone revenues didn't constitute the majority of all their revenues.
Yeah.
And I think everyone's quite right to point that out as a sort of inflection point. But the only point I will make about that is the service revenues, which is what's really growing for them, and which is a priority, I think are totally dependent on the install base of iPhones.
Yeah, yeah.
So what it can't do, and I'm not saying you necessarily said this, but what Apple couldn't do is just pivot entirely in favour of services. It's still completely reliant on there being a big install base of principally iPhones, I would say, obviously iPads as well.
Although I think that's changing with the TV move.
Well, we'll see. I mean, they haven't got any install base really
on
TV
but
right now.
That's kind of where they're counting on a lot of the growth coming from in the services business. Yeah.
A lot of people have Apple TV. More than you think. Yeah.
I guess so.
That's
not that expensive.
That TV push is where they're kind of, and that's a sort of disaggregated model. So you can get it on your Samsung too.
No, I will.
No, I think
I'll concede, as Pierre rather bluntly pointed out, that I might not be a complete expert on the matter of Apple TV. So I'll just shut up on that one.
No, I don't know either.
All right, Pierre, are you happy now?
I don't think you're wrong.
You're supposed to be facilitating this
I think
podcast.
none of us is right, to put it this way. Yeah.
The smartphone's dead.
But anyway, headline. I mean, I still think even if Apple TV is great and they really knock it out of the park, I still think the smartphone is the primary digital device, primary internet device for people for the foreseeable future. I just can't see what it would be replaced with.
Well,
it's what we carry around with us the whole time.
Did you hear about I think we talked about this, the Netflix plan to introduce $3 a month subscriptions in India?
Yeah, well,
only on mobile devices. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I thought, that's really cheap. But then I realized, guess how much is Amazon Prime for the whole year?
Oh yeah, you asked.
No,
in India.
Oh,
I don't have to guess because you told me.
$15.
$15.
So then, how many? That's $1 or something a month, and then Netflix is trying to get $3 out of them.
Netflix is going up here as well. They're putting the prices up.
Yeah, by £1. Yeah.
Yeah, well, India's a really interesting growth market. There was one other thing. The guys at Counterpoint mentioned this other vendor called Realme, I think, and they've gone from almost no shipments last year to about 5 million. They've gone from 0 to 60, and they seem to be a sort of classic sort of Chinese Shenzhen type of vendor. In fact, they're loosely owned by the same company that owns OnePlus and owns Oppo.
Right.
But what
they seem to have come out of nowhere. Oppo, maybe they haven't, but I've never been aware of them until
they were around.
They've
been around in China for a little while. Right. But yeah, China's such a massive market
that
you can go from 0 to 60.
And everything now. Oppo.
Yeah.
Their names all over the place at sports events.
No, I've noticed that. Yeah, no, and certainly back when I was at SA, they were just some random obscure little, and I just didn't really care about them. I figured that they were just a Chinese brand, and there wasn't any international relevance. That's obviously changed. But then that was the same Xiaomi at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, they went international.
Show me the money.
Show me the money. One of my better headlines.
This is not going to go away, is it?
We got to think of an Oppo headline. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Yeah. I'll leave that with you, Ian. Right. You can be VP of Oppo headlines. Vivo, which is really big in China, I don't think is doing anything very international.
Yeah.
But this Realme and like OnePlus is quite popular over here, like in Western markets. Realme is focused on India. Now, India they have sort of per capita disposable income actually considerably lower than China, I think. So you've really got to position something. If you want any kind of mass market, it's got to be pretty cheap. But I think just like in China, I remember when we used to try and forecast the Chinese market, we didn't figure it'd be as big as it would be, because it's got to something like close to 100% smartphone penetration. There was always an assumption there'd be this sort of agricultural hinterland of skint Chinese that would never be able to afford a smartphone or anything. But people find a way when it's that desirable and that important a piece of kit. People just find the money. And that seems to be happening in India, but again at a lower level. You're not going to charge £1,000 in India and get many people. But a lot of these Chinese smartphone makers are really good at making what I call sub-premium. So OnePlus is a good example of that. Something that has 90 to 95% the feature set of a total premium phone, but costs about 2/3 or half.
Yeah.
And that's what seems to be working for this brand, Realme, in India. So yeah, that's interesting. And just to finish off on that Apple thing, yeah, I just thought that was the point I want to make. I mean, I think it is interesting how they're having to redefine themselves. I think their numbers are still pretty good, aren't they?
They were up 1%, I think, sales.
Yeah. And Apple's just always got scary numbers anyway.
I mean, one other bit that did quite well, I noticed, was the wearables home accessories bit, which I think probably had one of its best quarters.
Right.
It was up about 48%.
Yeah, I've heard that those little in-ear, they've been a real hit.
Yeah.
Oh, the AirPods, yeah.
The AirPods. That was
like
massive growth.
You don't like them? Why not?
Because they just sound slightly better than the
Bit
one
better
that
than
come
that
with the
thing
phone.
hanging out of your ear now.
No, sound-wise, these are better. No, there's no seal. I hate when,
okay.
There's no bass, nothing. I don't know. To me, I don't like them.
You're
The connection thing is amazing. Like, you open them and they connect instantly,
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Right.
But the sound quality is not there for me.
No, but the appeal of those little Bluetooth headphones, obviously no wires and all that.
Yeah.
It's good. They're good for running.
Quite. Yeah, I'll have to take your word for that. Stop showing off, skinny boy. Right, we better move it along because we've been banging on the first one. We've got two other things to chat about. Ian.
We've taken up loads of time, haven't we?
We have, so I'm moving it along.
Right.
Ian, what was your piece that you just published talking about oil and phones?
Yeah, well, it's sort of drawing a parallel between... So if you go back to the 1970s, OPEC was the kind of dominant force, I guess, in terms of oil production. Organisation of petroleum exporting countries, and there was a lot of concern about being reliant on a fairly small group of countries that had the power to kind of block shipments or
and who
up
have
prices, and which they did in 1973.
And they got some ideas that don't necessarily entirely coincide with the Western world.
So you have what happened in 1973 was...
that was all about
OPEC,
Israel, wasn't it?
Yeah, OPEC decided that it would impose an oil embargo on countries that it saw as sort of sympathetic to Israel.
Yeah.
And it triggered a kind of crisis in the energy industry. It had a huge spike in oil prices.
Yeah.
But it also really kind of changed the industry. I think there's a really good book by a guy called Daniel Yeltsin called The Prize about the history of the oil industry.
Okay.
And he kind of sees 1973 as a kind of beginning of the kind of big shake-up that happened where you had this idea of energy security becoming really important to countries. So, the US decided it didn't want to be entirely dependent, for instance, on oil reserves in Iraq or wherever it might be. And then you had this kind of diversification push. So things like shale oil and everything have come out of that. And it kind of really shook up and changed the energy industry. And
and more vigorous prospecting in other places like Venezuela or whatever.
So I was sort of drawing a parallel between that and what we see going on now in telecom, where you've got, if you go back 15, 20 years, there used to be quite a lot of competition on the vendor side of the market. You had companies like Lucent, Alcatel, Nortel Networks. I think at one stage there were sort of 8 or 10 kit suppliers selling mobile infrastructure.
Yeah.
And through the years, that's kind of consolidated down to just 3 big companies, basically, which is Ericsson and Nokia in Europe and then Huawei in China. And you add in the fact that there's now all this concern about a little bit of ZTE, a little bit of Samsung. But to be honest, they're kind of subscale players. They're not really active in a lot of markets. They're sort of picking and choosing.
I'm sure ZTE would beg to differ.
They might. But and then you throw into the mix, you've got all this concern now all of a sudden about Huawei, and there's a backlash against them. There's concern about Chinese spying, and whether they're
all that stuff,
whether they're a good actor on the world stage, and the sort of efforts to try and get them banned. And if that happens, and it has kind of happened in a couple of markets, so I think Australia's actually imposed an official ban in
certainly for the 5G network they have.
You're really down to a couple of big companies. And it's triggered this. I mean, the expression's been mentioned a few times. Telecom security, not in the sense of making sure that spyware doesn't get into the networks, just making sure you have a diverse array of suppliers. Because if something were to happen to Ericsson or Nokia, and if they're the only two companies that you're buying from, then you're really you're almost sort of at the mercy of these enormous kit vendors for something that's extremely important. And I think it's become more important with 5G because everybody's saying 5G could be we don't know really, but everybody's kind of pinning their hopes on 5G as being this sort of big spur to productivity. And the stuff we've just been talking about, having faster phone connections, is all very well, but there's a hope that in years to come it will be a lot more than that. It'll be something that is used in industrial automation. It might power self-driving cars. It could be used in defence systems. So you don't really want something that's that critical being dependent on a handful of big companies. And you hear people like... So I tuned in when the UK government had its sort of big update on the supply chain review.
And they basically
kicked it down the road. Yeah. They don't really know what to do. But it was very interesting listening to Jeremy Wright, who's no longer the digital secretary, but used to be.
Fairly big cull of the cabinet.
Yeah, he got asked by another MP, I can't remember who it was, we don't really have diversification in the market, do we? We've got Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei. I think there might have been a reference to the fact that the UK used to have its own a kit vendor in the form of Marconi, if you go back years ago, which eventually got bought by Ericsson.
Yeah,
and he made this comment that there has to be a long-term goal to actually introduce more diversification into the market. And you've also seen Ofcom recently make moves like trying to carve out some spectrum that they would not sell to the operators, not license to the operators, actually provide it to companies and small organisations that want to build local 5G networks. You might just have a factory or campus network. And Mansour Hanif, who's the CTO, was talking at one of Informer's events recently, actually, and said one of the reasons for doing that is it might spur network innovation. Operators have been quite reluctant to go and buy from startups. Trying to get that ecosystem going has been difficult because they're used to working with the big.
And I don't know if it's you that's written about it or we've discussed it on the pod. I seem to remember us talking about something to do with the sort of procurement process by operators is incredibly sort of that's probably drawn out.
Yeah, maybe Jamie's written something.
Yeah, and that also creates a very high barrier to entry for startups.
Yeah. So I think the piece is really looking at those sort of trends and thinking about what that means for the kit vendors and the way the market develops. And I think if you look at some of the other interesting things that are going on at the moment, so this move by Ofcom to try and get more startups into the market. We've had for years now talk about more openness in networks and using technologies like virtualization to try and spur some innovation in that space. And there is a sign of things kind of happening there with this group called the Open RAN Alliance, which I think is quite significant because it's actually something that big operators are behind. If you look at I think AT&T, Verizon, NTT Docomo in Japan, all the big sort of international players are behind this organisation whose purpose is to try and bring new technologies into the market and to try and sort of shift away a little bit from
and that's where your analogy with the OPEC thing rings true. And presumably we look back on it historically, and OPEC kind of shot themselves in the foot by forcing the rest of the world to diversify away from them.
Yeah, and
you're kind of saying that the rest of the world is being forced to diversify by the fact that through a combination of sort of M&A and all this geopolitical
there's not been the same kind of trigger in the sense of someone coming along and slapping an embargo
but the
parallels this sort of dependence on this, for a very, very important industry, dependence on a very small kind of club, I guess. Instead of a group of nations that produce oil, in this case, it's a small number of companies that produce 5G gear, basically. And I think that's pushing governments and operators themselves to try and look for alternative suppliers. So who knows how it's going to play out? I mean, it's
got to be that startup thing. What's really hard to imagine is someone breaking into it. These are such large and well-established companies.
Yeah.
But then Huawei managed it 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Even if we discount some of the shortcuts it might have taken to get there.
Yeah, I think the other problem that you have is that network startups have always had trouble attracting interest from venture capital funds. That's always been a kind of barrier to...
Because it's so capital intensive.
Because it's capital intensive and the returns haven't been seen as, you know, as good as... Or they're not sexy companies compared to the kind of, you know, the .com firms in California that generate lots of excitement. So they've never had that kind of VC community around them. And you do get now some of the operators themselves trying to channel money into these groups. So there's a company in Japan called Rakuten, which I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but they're an e-commerce player, but they're building a network from scratch.
And they're just starting at 4G.
They're starting with 4G and 5G, basically, and they're building this network, a fourth network in Japan, completely from scratch. And whenever they go and present at an industry conference, the room's packed because everybody wants to hear how they're doing it.
And they're all doing the latest sort of virtualization.
Yeah, and all the companies they are using some traditional kit vendors, so Nokia plays a role in that, but they have companies like Mavenir and Altiostar, which are, I mean, Mavenir is not a startup; it's a more sort of mid-sized company. But Altiostar is a company that they've actually pumped funding into Altiostar, so they're kind of supporting one of the vendors that's building their network. I think they're based in the US, but yeah, I think so.
Don't know.
So good guess, mate.
I'll have a look.
If they're based in Israel, I need to change my article.
It could get awkward. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, and that's what moves me on to your beat, Paula.
Yep.
Obviously, the same, you know, this is a global thing. This sort of mainly sort of three big kit vendors, a couple of other fairly big ones. But, you know, I know in Africa in general, I'm pretty sure, I'm not going to say I know because I'm going to defer to your expertise on this, but the Chinese vendors don't seem to suffer those same kind of restrictions as we're getting in, for example, the UK, and they're pretty prominent. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. I guess Africa in general has always had a pretty close relationship with China. And so Huawei, I think across the continent, it's something like 70% of networking is Huawei.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's massive.
70%.
Yeah, that's what an analyst told me the other day.
And a lot of the rest, I imagine, is ZTE is quite strong there, isn't it? Or is it not as much?
Fairly, coming in recent years. Obviously, Nokia and Ericsson are also around. I think Nokia is maybe a bit stronger, but I'm not sure. And a lot of the operators, well, in South Africa at least, use all the vendors, you know, because it's that thing. They don't want to be stuck with just one.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are, you know, have a bigger dependence on Huawei. I think Telkom has a lot of Huawei equipment in South Africa, and MTN's also has quite a lot. But across the continent, they're pretty embedded, and Africa's not as concerned with Huawei and security issues.
So you're telling me that the South African Prime Minister, was sounding fairly defiant, President, on that reminder?
Yeah, he went a bit rogue a few weeks ago. He made a speech at a Fourth Industrial Revolution conference, and where he called America jealous of Huawei.
Okay.
And said that they were a victim in this political sort of fight between China and America.
Which is a fairly reasonable thing to say, but not that common for a politician to say that publicly.
No.
Not if he wants to stay sweet with the
a few people said they thought he was maybe a bit...
drunk.
On power, no. That probably wasn't the best thing to do. But then Kenya a few weeks ago, also the ICT minister, wasn't quite so strong as that, but said, you know, we're not going to have decisions made in the US and then we have to follow. We're going to make our own decisions about this, which I think is pretty much what Africa... I mean, in general, African leaders don't ever want to listen to the West and be told what to do.
No.
It shows what a geopolitical issue it's become, though, doesn't it, really, with...
that actual people
politicians getting involved in this.
So interestingly, in South Africa, also Ramaphosa, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, was also speaking about the 4 big operators sent him a letter in South Africa and basically said, you need to step in because this is going to be a big problem for us if Huawei is banned. And it's going to be a problem for the economy.
Right.
And so he was sort of referencing that.
So maybe that's him sort of signalling to them that he's got their back.
Yeah, I think maybe to some extent, but maybe he was a little bit overzealous.
And this is why they don't want to... It's the same thing here. You know, the UK operators don't want Huawei banned because they've used them quite heavily for building out their radio access networks. So if you do ban them, then you've all of a sudden got to go and replace equipment.
And they don't want to have their choice restricted.
They don't want to have their choice restricted. Yeah. I mean, especially in a market like Africa, I'm guessing, they've always been regarded as a kind of cost leader. And in an economy where there's a lot of low-income communities, and ARPUs, I'm imagining, are a lot less in some parts of the country. You really need to have a low-cost network provider. So,
and I think that's kind of what plays into it. In Africa, getting access and connectivity at a lower cost is more important maybe than the security issue.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's kind of like we need to deal with this first kind of situation.
Yeah, the hit to the economy could be massive in a country in a continent like that.
And people are like, we need to give people access. We need people to have devices and ability to communicate, and so the security concern is maybe a little bit lower down the list.
I'm sure.
And have there been comments by other like African leaders on a similar sort of similar tone to?
I was actually looking. I was trying to find. No one else has really come out as strongly, as far as I could find. Nigeria, there was like a slight mention. They were also, but very non-committal.
Yeah.
Just saying, well, Huawei's here, and we
Deal with
give
it.
opportunity to all people and vendors, and
sitting on the fence, which is also fair enough.
I think some of them maybe don't want to speak out about it too much because obviously politically it's a tricky thing. But I think they're going to make their own decisions unless there's a ban that's directly going to force like an Android type situation, where people everywhere all over the world won't be able to gain access to something.
But I wonder whether Africa is so heavily reliant on Huawei, it kind of reinforces this point about telecom security, really, that at some point down the road, when African countries start to think more about 5G and about using it for a self-driving car, let's say in 15, 20 years' time, I don't know. Do you really want just one?
No.
70% of your infrastructure is provided by a Chinese company.
Yeah.
And there's no African.
We almost like
startups
too
there
far
that
down
are-
the road for that. There's a lot of
Right.
stuff that's provided by Chinese companies all over Africa, roads, fiber optic networks, all sorts. So
Same
no,
thing's
I'm not
happening
saying
in
I'm not saying
Russia.
it's good that they're saying security is maybe not as important as access at the moment and pricing. It's going to be a problem down the road, but I just think maybe they.
So a couple of sort of geopolitical things occur to me there. That sort of heavy reliance by a lot of the continent on sort of partnership with China or Chinese companies for things like infrastructure just makes me think of that broader Belt and Road strategic plan that China has, which, if we characterise it not very favourably, is a sort of economic imperialism drive, i.e. how much of the world can we have so tied to us economically that we therefore influence them. And before anyone thinks it, that's what the West's done for centuries. So I'm not making a moral point about it, but the Chinese seem to be quite open that that's what they want to do. They got tons of cash. They're the world's sort of bankers in terms of. I mean, they own a hell of a lot of like US debt, don't they?
Yeah.
They got tons of cash, and they don't see, and they think it's their turn to kick some ass globally. They're not, thankfully, inclined to do so militarily, as far as we can tell, but they do want to do it economically. So that's interesting. And then the other thing that interested me that you said something about African countries not wanting to be sort of told what to do by the West. Is this, do you think, a sort of I don't know, a sort of post-colonial,
For sure.
Yeah, that sort of thing. It's just like, all right, you're Jamaican,
Like
now we're doing
we're
our own
past that
thing.
now. We're gonna
Yeah.
Trevor Noah has a joke about South Africa that when the world goes one way, South Africa goes the other way. Also, it's a little bit of a, I don't know.
So there's a bit of contrarianism.
We don't want to be controlled anymore. I feel like there is a feeling like that from a lot of African leaders. I mean, they'll obviously play nice on the world stage to some extent.
Yeah.
But then they also call America jealous.
And presumably there isn't any kind of post-colonial hangover with respect to China. So there might be a bit less resistance.
No, but I guess, I mean, what you're saying is it's its own form of colonialism in a way, right? So maybe there will be at some point.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I mean, so South Africa is part of BRICS. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And so we've always had very close ties, with China, and that whole thing just makes it stronger, the economic
that whole
group.
large emerging economy thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the thing. So they're never going to stand up against China. I don't think.
No.
But
it looks like geopolitically a lot of countries. So we take it as read, like for the UK, I think sooner or later we'll probably cave. You said that we've kicked the can down the road. Right now, Boris Johnson's got 3 months to sort out Brexit.
Yeah.
He's not really going to think about anything else.
He's got bigger issues, right?
Yeah. So he's just going to go, look, let's just park this for a bit.
It could tie into that, though, couldn't it, I suppose?
In what way?
Well, I think there's obviously pressure on the UK to exclude Huawei coming from the US, and I think it's been suggested that if they don't sort of do what the US wants, then it might be difficult for them to get the sort of favourable trade agreement they want after Brexit.
Well, let's say we do leave on WTO terms, which is looking increasingly likely because there doesn't need to be any useful negotiation going on about the withdrawal agreement. Then and then Trump's come over and come out with his usual, we'll give you a beautiful trade deal sort of stuff. And that's fine. I believe, even reading between the lines of his sort of certain style of delivery, I believe he means it. But then he's also, everyone's predatory. The UK is going to be in this position where everyone, if we're suddenly free of Europe, we'll have China clamouring for our attention, we'll have the US clamouring for our attention, we're going to be stuck in the middle. And we're kind of going to have to kind of make a choice. And in a way, the Huawei decision could be a sort of barometer. It could be emblematic of that choice.
And it could also guide what other countries do. I mean, I think that was suggested in the House of Commons debate session about it. They do seem to be leaning quite heavily at the moment, reading between the lines and listening to other comments that Jeremy Wright said, and also talking to Huawei people. I think there's an expectation what might happen is some requirement for diversification.
Right.
So in the first instance, that's going to mean, because you've only really got Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, that you have to have more than one of them in your network. And I wonder what that means for a company like 3UK, for instance, which is pretty much all in with Huawei on the radio access network side. I mean, they used Nokia for 3G, they used Samsung for 4G, but they're shifting. It seems like they're shifting everything over to Huawei.
Right.
So you do wonder if they would have to, if that is what happens, and the government comes out and says you can use Huawei, but you have to have 50% of your network built with another provider, then that's a company that could have an impact.
Yeah, and in their quarterlies, Huawei was making quite sort of bullish comments about the UK. But on the flip side, if Boris Johnson chats to Trump and Trump goes, look, it's pretty straightforward. Do what you're told, and we'll give you the best trade deal ever, and then you can tell Europe and go and do one. Yeah, because we'll do a great trade deal with you. But it'll be contingent on playing ball on the Huawei situation.
And if they do that, then if they do that and decide to exclude Huawei, then this diversification issue remains, that you then need to find some other way of getting other competition into the market, because you're basically stuck with only Ericsson and Nokia. And this kind of tied in with the piece I wrote, that I think you're seeing fragmentation happening really at the moment across the industry. I mean, you listen to what people like Ericsson and Nokia are saying. So I had an interview with Nokia's CFO last week when their results came out, and he said, we're seeing some pressure in China at the moment. And I said, what do you mean by that? They favour local vendors. There might be a chance we have to sort of reconsider our commitment to the Chinese market. So you've clearly got a push in China coming from the government, I'm assuming, on China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Ucom use Huawei and ZTE more now than. I mean, they've always used those mainly, but.
And you're also getting Huawei on the smartphone side. I just wrote up Qualcomm's results, and Qualcomm had a fairly downbeat outlook, because it's saying that Huawei is focusing much more on the Chinese market now, which in turn, and Qualcomm doesn't have much of a piece of the action with Huawei, because Huawei makes its own chips and modems and stuff. But all the other Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi, all that lot use Qualcomm a lot.
Yeah.
So with Huawei refocusing on Chinese market, that's going to mean
squeezing
depressed.
them out.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of sort of domino effects and all that sort of thing. But I think we're running out a bit of time. I just wanted to sort of throw it back to you, Paula, as our special guest. So I know you're South African and you're based in South Africa.
Yeah.
But your beat is the whole continent. Are there any other sort of countries or bits of the continent that you've been sort of hearing any interesting telecoms-y stuff about?
Yeah, I think Ethiopia is actually a really interesting one at the moment, because it's sort of one of the last countries that isn't open in terms of telecoms operators. They only have one operator that's most government owned. I don't know if it's completely government owned or mostly. No, it is completely, I think. And they are now opening up.
Okay.
Their prime minister, who came in last year, is opening up all sorts of sectors, so aviation and banking, and wanting sort of private investment.
Oh right. So they're going through like a bit like what happened to China about 20 or 30 years ago, where they're just opening up the economy. Pretty
much, yeah. And so telecoms is one of the big pushes, that they're going to sell off part of Ethio Telecom, and then issue 2 more licenses, they say, in the first quarter of 2020. So every man and his dog wants that license.
I bet.
Yeah. So all the big players on the continent.
It's like the sort of Wild West, just greenfield business opportunities.
Well, it's also a huge country. It's 100 million people.
Is it?
Yeah.
And the economy's doing quite well.
Blimey, I've been keeping track.
Right.
Yeah. So it's one of the last big, areas where, there's a lot of money to be made, I'm guessing.
Well, I remember Orange talking about it at an update they did in London a few weeks ago. I think it was
because Orange is pretty keen on Africa,
basically said that they would. I think I'm remembering it right, that they said they'd be keen to go and either buy into Ethio or get a license.
Yeah, and both MTN and Vodacom have told me that too, that they're definitely applying. But I mean, if they're only giving 2, there's a lot of other operators. Airtel. I mean, I'm sure they're all interested.
And if the Ethiopian government's got any sense, they'll do an auction and just rake it in.
Yeah. So we'll have to see, but that'll be coming.
100 million people. I never realised it was that populous.
Yeah.
102 million, I think.
So when I used to, part of this great big forecast that I was telling you, there's 88 countries. We didn't. I don't think. Yeah, that's not, how many countries are in the world? Is it like 200?
220
or
something?
We wouldn't have covered all the countries in Africa, and obviously there's some pretty small ones.
Yeah, I mean they're 54 just in Africa, so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so there we are. I'm trying to remember whether we broke out. I don't think we even broke out Ethiopia specifically at all. That was just in our rest of Africa. So that's interesting. I think that's why it took me by surprise that it was as populous as it is. Obviously, Nigeria is actually huge. Yeah. South Africa is.
So that was only about 60 million.
Right, but as an economy within the region.
Yeah.
And then you've got some of the North African ones like Egypt are pretty big.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Kenya also.
It's unbelievable, really, that a market of that size. It's quite a young population as well. Ethiopia, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean Africa in general.
Not really open and not deregulated. You can understand why companies want to get in there, I guess. Yeah.
Well, with all due respect to the continent, some countries are governed by some pretty crazy people.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the UK can't speak at the moment.
Yes, well.
Yeah.
So,
people in glass houses. Good point, Paula. Cool. Okay. Well, that's really interesting insight about Ethiopia, and I'll sort of keep an eye on it. I think we've done about an hour, and I think we might have got at least another couple of wickets in that time, as my furtive glances at my phone have revealed.
Excited about that.
Yes. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.